Let's start with a scene. A school in Gaza's Shati refugee camp, repurposed as a shelter, crowded with displaced families. A mother named Hadija Husni is there, watching her children. She said they were just beginning to breathe, just starting to feel that fragile, tentative sense of quiet, daring to imagine how they might rebuild our lives. You can almost feel that moment, can't you? The first collective sigh of relief after weeks of terror. The hope that the words ceasefire and truce might actually mean something this time. And then the explosions start again. That brief hope, as one journalist there put it, turned into despair. Hadija's children can't sleep. They thought the war was over, she says. It's a crime, either truce or war, not both. This is the strange contradictory reality on the ground. On one side, you have diplomats and officials talking about agreements, mediation, and a resumed ceasefire. And on the other, you have Hadija's children wide awake in the dark, living through the proof that the word and the reality have become two different things. Okay, let's unpack this contradictory reality. We're looking directly at this gap, the space between the diplomatic language of a political deal and the lived experience of persistent violence. We need to look specifically at the systemic human rights crises surrounding detainees and the deep, pervasive psychological damage that threatens any chance of long-term peace.
That is precisely our mission today. We are tasked with analyzing what happens when the temporary state of truce fails immediately and persistently. We need to connect this to the bigger picture, examining how deep-seated grievances, from prison conditions that are being described as torture camps, to the collective trauma of continuous war act as powerful, almost inevitable forces against stability and reconciliation. We need to understand not just the events, but the profound implications that make this conflict so intractable.
So the immediate collapse here, following that October 10th agreement, was just so rapid, so harrowing. The truce was barely holding, almost immediately revealing its profound fragility. We saw a stark example of the violence resuming in the north, specifically Beit Lahia, with a reported airstrike.
Right. The Israeli military claimed they targeted a claimed weapons site posing a direct threat.
But the immediate reality on the ground, reported by the local hospital, was the death of 2 people.
And that fragility wasn't just about isolated airstrikes. The larger systemic breakdown, it was reportedly triggered by the killing of an Israeli soldier down in Rafa, in Gaza's south.
And the reaction from Israeli leadership? Swift and forceful.
Extremely. Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered strong retaliatory strikes in response to that reported incident. The subsequent attack was massive. The Gaza Health Ministry reported 104 people killed and noted explicitly that the victims were mostly women and children.
A staggering civilian toll right away.
It was, even if the Israeli military did later claim to have eliminated dozens of Hamas militants in that same operation, this rapid escalation just shows how thin that veneer of quiet really was.
That initial incident, the killing of the soldier, and then that massive retaliatory strike, it really demonstrates how easily kinetic action can just erase diplomatic intent. But let's zoom in on maybe the psychological warfare of that near truce. Yeah. Think about that fragile, tentative sense of quiet that was shattered. We heard the story of Yusuf, a father in Beit Lahia. Just hours before that devastating strike, he had managed to find a charging station with fuel and brought home a charged battery pack.
A small thing, but huge in that context.
Exactly. His family felt that tiny flicker of normalcy, that moment where they dared to believe the quiet was real. Then, boom, the explosion shook the street, close enough to shatter their windows.
That sudden, violent disruption, that sound of breaking glass after a moment of hope, makes the term persistent fragility excruciatingly real. It moves beyond political jargon, doesn't it?
It really does. It's the violation of hope itself. And what's fascinating, or maybe disturbing, is how the diplomatic machine reacts to this immediate violent failure. Yeah. U.S. President Trump, for example, asserted publicly that the ceasefire was not threatened. Why? Why that insistence?
Well, that specific contradiction is perhaps one of the most dangerous factors here. When you have a massive civilian death toll immediately following a negotiated truce, the diplomatic success is undeniably compromised, right?
Obviously.
So for international actors, particularly those invested heavily in the mediation, acknowledging that the truce is completely dead, well, that means acknowledging the breakdown of their entire leverage framework. It means mediation has failed, international pressure has failed, and the only remaining option seems to be continued conflict.
So asserting it's not threatened is almost a political necessity to keep the door open, however shaky.
Exactly. It's the utility of maintaining the diplomatic illusion, you could say. Keep the channels open for the next round of negotiation, even if this one is collapsing.
Meanwhile, the mediators on the ground, specifically the Qatari delegation, they expressed frustration over the violence, sure, but they continued to signal anticipation for the next phase of the process. And this next phase, they noted, would include Hamas's eventual disarmament, which seems like a big leap, right? Why mention disarmament when the current immediate truce is falling apart?
It really underscores the different timelines at play, I think. The mediators are, well, they're playing the long game. For them, the violence is a setback. Yes, a terrible one, but perhaps a momentary setback in their larger phased plan for de-escalation and eventually a political settlement. Their goal isn't just stopping the bombing today, it's restructuring the political and security landscape for tomorrow. So by mentioning disarmament, they are kind of managing expectations for the final outcome, even while the present is spiraling.
Okay, that makes sense. And Hamas, for its part, they denied any association with the Rafa shooting that killed the Israeli soldier. They reaffirmed their commitment to the truce, but then they signaled complications by delaying the transfer of a deceased captive's body, citing alleged Israeli violations of the ceasefire.
Right, and that fueled Israeli counterclaims that Hamas was deliberately stalling the transfer process.
So it just feeds the cycle of mistrust.
Precisely. That delay, citing prior violations, it just becomes another layer of mistrust. It can justify further military action or diplomatic hardening on the other side. It becomes this cycle where every action is viewed through a lens of zero-sum suspicion.
Given this immediate cycle of violence and counteraccusation, why do international voices keep using such strong language? Like the UN Secretary General issuing a strong condemnation of the Israeli airstrikes causing civilian deaths, including children. And this was strongly echoed by the UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, who urged all parties not to let peace slip away. Does this strong language actually do anything?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the international demand for commitment is clear, absolutely. But the evidence suggests international condemnation has virtually no momentum against the immediate momentum of conflict. Not in the short term, anyway. International pressure in this context often feels like rhetorical posturing. It serves to establish a moral record, maybe satisfy domestic political needs in the condemning countries.
But it doesn't exert genuine immediate leverage on the combatants.
Not usually, no. The ground reality is that immediate reactive violence consistently overrides these diplomatic efforts. It makes these strong condemnations, however morally necessary they are, functionally pretty ineffective in stopping the violence right then and there.
So let's pivot then, from the skies over Gaza to what's happening in the institutions of control. Because the breakdown of trust isn't just visible in the streets. It's happening behind closed doors, in places where the word truce has, well, it's probably never held any meaning inside the prison system.
Yes, let's transition there. This is one of the most significant internal pressures really exacerbating the conflict,
Right.
the incarceration system. And the scale of this operation has changed dramatically since October 7th. The total number of Palestinian security prisoners in Israeli custody nearly doubled. It skyrocketed from about 5,192 just before the war to a staggering 9,623 by July 2024.
Nearly double. That's a massive systemic expansion of control.
That is.
And this expansion reflects an incredibly wide net being cast, right? It's not just those affiliated with armed groups we're talking about.
Not at all. Those arrested include physicians, academics, lawyers, students, even children, political leaders too. And crucially, the military sweeps up people vaguely defined as men of fighting age from Gaza, many taken into custody during military activity on the sole grounds of that definition. They're treated often as a homogeneous, faceless mass.
And their introduction to this system, it sounds like it's designed to be immediately psychologically and physically devastating.
It does. One released prisoner, Fouad Hassan, recounted his arrival at Megiddo prison. He said, "We were taken to Megiddo. When we got off the bus, a soldier said to us, 'Welcome to hell.'"
Welcome to hell.
It sets the tone. It sets the tone for the systemic institutional abuses documented in the testimonies of 55 released prisoners that were analyzed.
The report details a systemic, institutional policy focused on the continual abuse and torture of all Palestinian prisoners. We are talking about frequent, arbitrary, and severe violence, carried out by soldiers, IPS guards, special forces, often under a shroud of anonymity. We need to pause here. This isn't just listing facts, we're documenting systemic cruelty.
Yes, these were not isolated incidents, according to the testimonies. They describe beatings with rifle butts, wooden clubs, metal batons, brass knuckles. They also detail the deployment of pepper spray, stun grenades, and setting dogs on prisoners. There was one particularly gruesome account noting a dog biting a prisoner in the arm until he bled profusely.
And these assaults frequently resulted in severe injuries, loss of consciousness, broken bones.
Correct. The purpose seems not merely punishment, but a systematic dismantling of the individual's will, their very sense of self.
And the cruelty extends beyond physical injury, right? Moving into profound psychological abuse and degradation.
Absolutely. Testimonies describe humiliation tactics like strip searches conducted solely for the purpose of degradation, not for any security reason, explicit threats to kill inmates if they attempted to pray. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the psychological torment was this practice of forced blasphemy. Guards screaming at them to curse God and their mothers.
Forced blasphemy.
Yeah, and the screams of other tortured inmates were often played aloud. Some describe the psychological impact of that as worse than the physical beatings themselves.
Unimaginable. And the testimonies also repeatedly reveal the use of explicit acts of sexual violence.
Yes, as an additional punitive and humiliating measure. Witnesses described blows to the genitals, the use of metal tools and batons to inflict genital pain, the grabbing of testicles during transport, and those humiliating strip searches again.
This is where the legal context becomes critical, isn't it? The mention of the Rome Statute.
Yes, that's extremely important, but it's often glossed over. We need to explain why this matters legally. The Rome Statute is the foundational treaty of the International Criminal Court, the ICC. It defines the most serious crimes of international concern. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. Now, the systematic nature of sexual violence, whether it's physical assault or profound humiliation committed against a civilian population, which is how many of these detainees are classified, that potentially falls under the definition of a crime against humanity under the statute.
So presenting this finding isn't just documenting prisoner abuse.
No, it's identifying the most severe legal charge being leveled against the systemic policy. It elevates the issue far beyond standard human rights complaints into the realm of international criminal law.
And this institutional cruelty is reinforced by the deliberate deprivation of basic necessities, overcrowding, for instance.
Severe overcrowding. Cells push way beyond capacity, forcing many to sleep on the floor. One prison commander was apparently noted as proudly describing the conditions. Reportedly, noting 10 to 12 terrorists in each cell kept inside for 23 out of 24 hours. The protocols were radically changed, denying them access to the yard for months, a direct violation of the basic right to an hour of fresh air.
And this denial of movement is connected to deliberate starvation policies.
It seems so. Prisoners spoke of extreme, constant hunger and thirst, receiving very little food, often undercooked or past its expiry date. The previous ability they had to prepare their own food or buy items from the prison canteen, that was eliminated entirely.
And the official response.
When challenged on this, the state's position, based on a retroactive menu assessment apparently, claimed the menu provided only 200 calories above the required average for sedentary prisoners.
That calorie justification is, well, it's stunning. It's a stunning example of self-serving, almost tautological cruelty.
Oh, so?
They are forcibly denied movement, kept inside 23 hours a day, and then the state uses that forced lack of movement, their forced sedentary state, to justify near starvation rations.
Ah, I see. The system creates the conditions for extreme deprivation.
And then uses those very conditions to retroactively justify the deprivation. It's circular logic serving cruelty.
Absolutely. And the medical neglect completes this picture of institutionalized indifference. The refusal to provide essential medical care, even in life-threatening situations, was reportedly widespread. Guards and medics claimed they were just following instructions. The most common treatment, regardless of the ailment, whether it was scabies or severe pain, was a single tablet of acetaminophen or paracetamol.
Which gave rise to the name, the Tylenol policy.
Exactly.
The horrific consequences of this negligence. They're tragically illustrated by that case of a prisoner from Gaza held at the Seed Timon military detention facility. His leg had to be amputated.
Yes, due to a combination of injuries apparently caused by soldier violence, the harsh incarceration conditions, and subsequent indifference and negligence by the facility's personnel.
We have to pause here again. He recalled soldiers laughing and mocking him as he was told the decision, saying cut off his leg.
That's what was reported. This isn't just abuse. This is systemic cruelty designed to break the individual. And it must have a devastating effect on any reconciliation efforts down the line. It creates a deep, indelible wound, not just for the individual, but for the entire community represented by the reported 60 Palestinians who have died in Israeli custody since the war started.
So this prison system, having established these conditions of systemic abuse, is also designed to be hermetically sealed off from external scrutiny. Is that right?
That seems to be the strategy. Explicit measures aimed at sealing off all oversight and creating a kind of legal vacuum.
Like what specifically?
While family visits were canceled altogether, meetings with legal counsel were denied for increasingly long durations, reaching up to 180 days, often justified by vague reasons like dynamic needs on the ground.
And no contact with the outside world.
The lack of transparency is really the oxygen for this abuse. A prisoner's account summarizes this chillingly. There was no contact with anyone on the outside, not even the Red Cross. So the prohibition of entry for the ICRC and human rights organizations, coupled with confiscating communication tools like TVs and radios, it created a state of total isolation, making verification of the abuses impossible from the outside.
And this isolation was given a kind of legal cover by the classification of detainees. Israel brought many of the arrests from Gaza under the controversial Unlawful Combatants Law of 2002. For listeners who haven't encountered this legal framework, can you explain how classifying someone as an unlawful combatant fundamentally strips them of basic rights?
Yes, this is a crucial piece of legal jargon, but it has huge implications. The Unlawful Combatants Law from 2002 was designed, ostensibly, to deal with combatants who don't belong to state armies and aren't considered protected persons under the Geneva Conventions. The critical effect of this status is that it allows for indefinite military detention without charge or trial, and crucially, without the rights normally afforded to prisoners of war or even standard criminal procedure protections.
So it creates the ultimate legal vacuum.
Exactly. It allows authorities to bypass many legal checks and balances.
And the numbers involved here are staggering. The Association for Civil Rights in Israel noted that before the recent ceasefire deals, the Israeli Prison Service was holding 2,673 prisoners, categorized specifically as unlawful combatants.
That's a huge number held in this legal limbo. And the denial of oversight became official policy when Israel banned the ICRC, the Red Cross, from visiting these specific detainees.
And there was an explicit reason given for that ban.
Yes. Defense Minister Israel Katz explicitly stated that Red Cross visits would seriously harm the state's security, and he said the ban would be maintained until all hostages are back.
Wow, so that directly ties the basic human rights of thousands of detainees held without charge, potentially subject to severe abuse, to the progress of the hostage negotiations.
Precisely. Hamas, predictably, called this a violation, part of a systematic policy involving killing, torture, starvation, medical neglect, and the withholding of information.
This political hardening, this instrumentalization of detainee rights, it contrasts sharply with the high-profile focus on specific detainees, doesn't it? It shows how human rights can become, well, currency. We have to look at Marwan Barghouti here, the high-profile Fatah leader often referred to as the Palestinian Nelson Mandela, serving multiple life sentences.
Yes, the international advocacy for Barghouti has been intense and highly visible. You had the Elders Group, made up of former world leaders, calling for his release. They even appealed directly to U.S. President Trump. They cited his long-standing advocacy for the two-state solution, urging his protection from abuse while incarcerated.
So this really highlights a powerful dual reality, doesn't it? Basic international human rights, the right to medical care, legal access, ICRC visits are systemically denied to thousands held in this legal gray zone.
While at the same time, international diplomacy focuses intense pressure and attention on one major political figure.
It illustrates how the incarceration system and the treatment of detainees become leverage points in political negotiations.
Exactly. The fate of thousands is subjected to deliberate isolation and, according to these reports, systemic cruelty, while the fate of one high-profile political figure is the focus of global diplomatic pressure. Human rights concerns become instrumentalized, used as bargaining chips, rather than being upheld universally as they should be. And this, of course, further entrenches the grievances that undermine any eventual path to stability.
Let's turn now to the psychological architecture of the conflict, because it's profoundly damaged by this continuous cycle of violence and institutional cruelty we've been discussing. For the population of Gaza, trauma isn't something that happens and then you recover from. It's described as ongoing.
That's right. Psychologists point out that the continuous low-intensity warfare of the blockade since 2005, coupled with these cyclical intense wars, means the psychological effect can't accurately be described as post-traumatic stress.
Because the stress is never post. The trauma never actually ends.
Precisely. This creates what's known as multi-traumatic losses. In many conflict zones, people might lose a home or a job, or a family member. Terrible, of course. But in Gaza, during these continuous operations, many people have lost all of those things simultaneously. Home, family, job, sense of safety, often all at once.
And this multi-layered loss, it must destroy the fundamental sense of safety that's essential for human development and stability. How do you plan for a future?
Exactly. How do you plan when the foundational elements of your present, your home, your family structure, your economic means, can be destroyed in an instant, and have been repeatedly?
The personal cost of this is just staggering. We heard the story of a 16-year-old boy in Rafa. He was getting counseling after enduring multiple wars already in his young life. He told a mental health worker he no longer feels scared during bombings. He just feels static, like a television with no signal.
Static, wow.
Yeah. During the bombing, he doesn't think about his future or college. He just counts the explosions. He seems to lack the emotional tools to even believe in a sustainable future. He views peace simply as the anxious quiet between violent escalations.
That's not post-traumatic stress. That's the destruction of the psychological foundation of the self, the ability to imagine a different future.
In that destruction of the self, it seems compounded by the extreme distrust we see in the latest joint Palestinian-Israeli surveys from July 2024.
Yes, the data there is stark. The overwhelming majority on both sides justify their own side's violence by pointing directly to the actions of the other side. It's that classic justification cycle. The Israeli siege justifies Hamas's actions in the eyes of many Palestinians. Hamas's attacks justify the Israeli military's response in the eyes of many Israelis.
It's a self-reinforcing moral narrative. It prevents any objective evaluation of one's own side's behavior, perhaps.
It certainly makes it very difficult, and this results in a near-total zero-sum mentality.
Zero-sum, meaning?
Meaning that three-quarters on both sides view the conflict in these terms. One side's gain is inherently the other side's loss. There's no room for mutual benefit or compromise.
And the level of distrust.
It's the highest ever recorded in these joint surveys. Standing at 90% or even higher, it suggests a complete collapse of faith in the other side's intentions, making any negotiation almost seem like an act of bad faith from the start.
And this profound distrust is amplified by dehumanization, isn't it?
Very much so. Both sides humanize their own people highly, scoring close to 90 points on average in the surveys, which is natural. However, the willingness to humanize the other side is shockingly low. Only 6 out of 100 Palestinians and 14 out of 100 Israeli Jews are willing to humanize the other on average.
6 and 14 out of 100. That's incredibly low.
It is. And dehumanization is widely understood as a psychological precondition for mass violence. It makes it easier to accept extreme military action and systemic abuse, like the prison conditions we just discussed. If the other side isn't fully human,
then their suffering doesn't register in the same way.
Exactly. We also have to consider the historical perspective of collective trauma because it powerfully drives policy and perception today.
Right. For Israelis, the central pivotal trauma is the Holocaust, the Shoah, which contributes to what some analysts call power dysmorphia. We should probably spend a moment on this because it's a crucial insight.
Yes, power dysmorphia is this idea, this genuine belief held by many in existential vulnerability despite possessing overwhelming military superiority in the regional context. It allows a state with unmatched power to operate with a deep, almost existential victim complex, stemming from those very real historical fears of persecution and annihilation rooted in the Shoah.
And how does that impact policy?
It directly impacts retaliatory policy. Every military threat, no matter how isolated or small scale, can be interpreted through this lens as an existential danger that requires a massive, perhaps disproportionate response for survival.
Okay. And for Palestinians, the central collective trauma is the Nakba, the catastrophe of displacement and land loss starting in 1948, which is seen as ongoing, compounded by continuous occupation and the blockade.
Right. So both groups are driven by these profound historical wounds that are constantly being reopened, re-aggravated by present-day events.
And this is where political exploitation comes in.
Precisely. Extremists and, frankly, opportunistic politicians on both sides actively exploit these deep, shared historical traumas to advance their own agendas, often agendas that undermine any chance for long-term reconciliation or peace. The reported statement by Prime Minister Netanyahu that supporting Hamas actually helps thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state, if accurate, illustrates this cynical exploitation perfectly.
So if the violence on one side is strategically useful to justify hardline politics on the other, say by isolating Palestinians in Gaza from those in the West Bank and making a unified government impossible, then these psychological wounds aren't just a byproduct of the conflict.
They become a tool actively used to sustain it.
Okay, so if the psychological backdrop is one of maximum distrust and exploited trauma, how did that translate into tangible support for political solutions, like the main one that's been on the table for decades, the two-state solution, TSS?
Well, the survey data reveals really unprecedented and divergent changes in attitudes toward the TSS concept just between 2022 and 2024, so in less than 2 years.
Divergent how?
The post-October 7th environment seems to have radically hardened Israeli Jewish attitudes against this outcome. Support for the basic concept of a two-state solution declined sharply among them. It dropped 13 points in that short period to a historic low of just 21%.
Only 21% support the idea. Wow.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Palestinian support showed the opposite trend. It actually rose from 33% in 2022 to 40% in 2024.
So support dropped significantly among Israelis, but went up among Palestinians. That divergence is striking. It signals a profound shift in priorities, probably driven by the recent conflict.
It seems likely.
Yeah.
And when you look at the alternatives they were asked about, the trends are even more concerning, particularly on the Israeli side. The most alarming trend is the unprecedented level of support for a non-democratic one-state solution among Israeli Jews. This is essentially annexation of territory without granting equal rights to Palestinians living there. Support for this stands at 42%. That's the highest ever recorded for that option. It signals a clear shift toward unilateral control as a desired outcome for a large minority.
42%. That's huge. And what about a democratic one-state solution with equal rights for everyone?
Much lower support. Only 25% of Palestinians support that, and just 14% of Israeli Jews.
Okay, this raises a critical question then. Is peace truly impossible when so many people seem to oppose the main proposed solutions or even support annexation?
Well, analysts looking at this data suggest maybe not. They point to another significant segment of the population, those who support no solution at all.
People who just want the status quo or don't see any viable path forward.
Exactly. The survey data shows that a large portion falls into this category. 44% of Palestinians and 34% of Israeli Jews in 2024 said they support no solution. Now, analysts see this undecided or perhaps resigned group as potentially the easiest segment to convert back to supporting something like the TSS if, and it's a big if, a credible, detailed political package were actually presented and pursued by leadership.
So it suggests that public opinion might not be this unmovable object, but maybe more a reflection of the current political vacuum. A lack of credible options being offered.
That's the argument, that public opinion is reflecting the failure of leadership more than an inherent impossibility.
And the power of providing clarity seems to confirm this idea, right?
Yeah.
Respondents were presented with a detailed 11-point peace package.
Yes, a very specific package, including elements like a demilitarized Palestinian state, agreed territorial exchanges based on the 67 borders, a shared status for Jerusalem, the negotiated return of about 100,000 Palestinian refugees to Israel, an end-of-conflict declaration, and so on.
And support for this detailed, comprehensive package.
It was 34% among Palestinians and 25% among Israeli Jews.
Okay, wait. 25% support for the detailed package among Israeli Jews.
Yes.
But didn't you say only 21% supported the general concept of a two-state solution?
Exactly. And that's the key counterintuitive finding that really demands attention here.
Support for the details is higher than support for the idea itself. That seems backward.
It is. It runs contrary to most previous political trends, where people generally prefer the ambiguity of a broad concept over potentially difficult specific compromises. It suggests that clear negotiated details, even if they contain elements that are hard to swallow for some, can actually modestly reduce hardline opposition better than vague political promises.
Maybe because a detailed plan appears more serious, more concrete, and potentially achievable, even if difficult.
That could be it. It perhaps signals real intent rather than just political rhetoric.
Now, to achieve any sustainable solution, we surely need to learn from past failures. The Oslo Accords are often cited as a major attempt that ultimately failed. But what went wrong there, according to analyses?
Several key things are often highlighted. A critical lack of clear grounding in international law from the start, the absence of strong third-party accountability and monitoring mechanisms, no real teeth to enforce compliance, and perhaps most importantly, a profound lack of inclusiveness. The negotiations were largely conducted by elites, often in secret, This created antagonism among groups on both sides who felt excluded or who stood to lose assets or status and weren't brought into the process.
So any future process needs to be genuinely inclusive. It needs to involve not just the leaders, but potentially the spoilers or potential losers, those groups that might otherwise try to sabotage the process.
Absolutely. The objective has to be to try and transform these opposing groups into beneficiaries, or at least stakeholders who see some advantage in the peace process succeeding. Analysts suggest that to achieve real popular legitimacy and durability, a peace agreement probably needs the support of maybe 2/3 of the population on both sides, not just a slim 51% majority.
2/3. That's a high bar, especially given the current numbers hovering around 25–34% for the detailed package. How do you possibly get from there up to 2/3?
The sources suggest specific incentives could bridge that gap. Concrete benefits tied to the peace process.
Such as?
Well, examples include things like financial compensation for Palestinian refugees for their losses, acknowledging that historical dimension of trauma, and also, significantly, compensation for Jewish refugees who were forced out of Arab countries, acknowledging their historical losses too, addressing trauma on both sides.
And crucially, anything else?
And critically, analysts suggest the phased release of Palestinian prisoners tied directly to the measurable progress of the peace process implementation.
The prisoners again. How much impact could that specific incentive have?
According to the projections based on the survey data, that specific incentive alone, a phased release tied to progress, could potentially raise Palestinian support for a comprehensive agreement all the way up to 73%.
73%. Just from that one incentive, that single data point is startling.
It is.
It suggests that releasing the thousands of individuals currently held, often under the conditions of systemic abuse we discussed earlier, isn't just a humanitarian issue, which it clearly is.
No, it's potentially the single most powerful political lever available to increase popular support for a lasting peace agreement on the Palestinian side.
So ultimately, what the evidence seems to suggest is that strong, legitimate, and credible leadership needs to actually seize the political moment.
Yes. If leaders today were to embark on serious negotiations, really commit to them, and offer these concrete, detailed incentives and a clear vision, the data shows the willingness of the two publics to support them is demonstrably present. It's latent, perhaps, but it's there.
So public opinion today isn't necessarily the impediment to peace.
That's the argument from this analysis. It's more a reflection of the leadership's failure, on both sides perhaps, to present a credible, inclusive package and actually seize the political moment to push for it.
Okay, so we've explored the immediate tragedy of the failing truce, grounding it in those personal stories of shattered quiet like Hadija Husni's. We detailed the systemic cruelty documented within the prison system based on those harrowing testimonies. And we mapped the profound social trauma and record-high distrust that has made the prospect of a political solution seen, at times, almost impossible.
And if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, the central finding from the latest data is really striking. Despite the unprecedented levels of pain, distrust, and hardening attitudes on both sides, public opinion right now is apparently not an inherent impediment to peace. The people seem to be waiting for a credible path forward. But the current reality of violence, dehumanization, and institutional cruelty is actively destroying the very psychological and social infrastructure needed to walk that path.
So what does this all mean at the end of the day? In a conflict where the trauma is continuous, where it never really becomes post-traumatic, where the psychological foundation for a shared future is being actively destroyed, where children feel only static instead of fear or hope, unable to imagine college or a future. The ultimate barrier to ending the suffering may not be the incompatibility of land claims or borders, as intractable as those are. It may be the deep shared loss of the collective ability to even imagine a mutually acceptable future at all. The loss of the basic psychological tool required for peace itself.